Dr. Bruce Piasecki is the founder of a global management consulting firm, AHC Group, and a New York Times bestselling author on shared value and social response capitalism. Bruce has worked for over a third of the Fortune 500 in change management, including BP, Merck, and Toyota. One of the earliest advocates for climate solutions, he has been an agent for change for over 40 years. He's also the co-founder of the Creative Force Foundation, which annually awards young authors writing on business and society issues. So thank you for joining. I'm really happy to have you here. I know that, there's a lot of authors I've worked with, and you have quite the resume and just a fascinating career path. So I'm really looking forward to talking to you and having you here today.
So I believe, at age 67, that the things that you didn't know when you started as a writer at 15 or 17, they become a little clearer about your path in retrospect. So I guess I would say that the first most critical thing is I've always loved books. I grew up in a family where after my father died when I was 3, my mother didn't have the money to buy books. But luckily, being a basketball star, I won a scholarship to some really good schools. I wound up playing basketball for Lefty Drysdale at the University of Maryland over summers on scholarship. And then I accepted a full scholarship at Cornell University, which is where I met my wife, Andrea Carroll Masters, an editor and a publisher. And what I would have to say is my career would not have been fateful were it not for meeting Andrea and finding a person who also loved books. And so we're sort of like hand in glove in the sense that she likes perfecting someone's creativity and I like creating a new book. And although
Right.
she's never edited my work, even when we were raising our children, books were a big part of our family. So I think my career path is a set of concentric circles where you start with the discovery that you want to write a book. And then there's a larger circle of family. And then there's a larger circle that I built a firm around my books. And then finally, there's the audience. So I don't think of it as a linear path. I think of it as a set of concentric circles, Joe.
Okay. So with that, I know you mentioned that you started a firm, AHC Group. Would you be able to just elaborate on what the work is that you're doing there?
Sure. So back in 1990, I got a contract from Simon & Schuster to write about the search for environmental excellence. And in the act of doing that, I met, again, people from the White House who wrote the afterword from the Office of Management Budget. I met Jacques Cousteau, and his son wrote the intro. What I found is that there was no difference between what I wanted to record as a social historian and what I was experiencing in my life. So I founded my firm right after my PhD in 1981. And the purpose of the firm is to change companies. It's a change management firm. And so we have the lawyers and the scientists and the MBAs who have the experience and the skill set to help a firm change. So to give you a concrete example, Joe, it took 4 years, but we had $1 million retainer from Merck, the pharma giant, and they wanted us to create an advisory council to change them regarding carbon and carbon impacts. So here you have a firm of more than 50,000 people. We're working for the top 40, and they're giving my firm $1 million a year. So I then appoint a team of 7 people to be change agents to work with the top 40 people at Merck, right? Their general counsel, their head of different divisions. And every 6 months, we would go inside of Merck with presentations on how they could change regarding what's called carbon neutrality. So in international law, there's rules about greenhouse gas emissions for scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, or suppliers. We did the $15 billion plan across the next 15 years for Merck by interacting with them as change agents. So they have the talent to make a drug like Keytruda, which is the #1 anti-cancer immune boosting So they know how to design the scientific molecules that allow modern medicine, right? But they don't know how to deal with the external stress of climate change. So we literally were hired for 4 years to come in and do that. So my firm, the AHC Group, is a change management firm.
Okay. And it's interesting talking to you because I feel like you have been an advocate for climate solutions for a very long time. And, what was it that really inspired you to start that work? And obviously the work that led to your book in 1995, Corporate Environmental Strategy.
Sure. So back when I was finishing that PhD, I was studying natural resource management. And at Cornell, that's a field that's mostly fish and wildlife management, how to improve the yield of fish or how to improve the yield of forests. But for some strange reason, I hung out with a bunch of people that were concerned about the impact of energy usage on society. So even before we had the phrase climate change, I was poking around with a lot of experts. And so in 1990, Peter Asmus, a journalist from California, and I wrote this Simon & Schuster book, which was the first book on climate solutions. Bill McKibben, who's now quite famous, a peer and a writer from the New Yorker, wrote the book on the problem of climate change.
Okay.
I wrote the book about how to search for the answer, how to move beyond blame into the answer. So I think that I got interested in energy and innovation, and that led us to be interested in climate change.
Was it challenging early on, like in the 90s and even early 2000s, to get companies to buy into the message, the message of climate solutions?
Absolutely. I think that one of the reasons I don't have any hair left, Joe, is that I pulled out a lot of hair traveling and bouncing around the world, knocking on the doors. So I think that the one thing in which being a change management consultant is similar to writing is that it takes persistence.
Yeah.
Right? You don't get an answer right away. You are often required to present a solution before people don't even know they have a problem. So again, going back to Merck, an exceptional sense of a general counsel who Jennifer was able to say at one point in our meetings, year 2, I know that there's no legal requirements for us to do this, but I'm going to take off my legal hat and put on my sustainability hat and say, we're going to work with Dr. Piasecki and his team because we want to be ahead of the law. And so we're going to reduce our carbon emissions and achieve neutrality faster than the law. Well, that's 1 out of 100. Most of the encounters that we had, we were retained to prepare a firm for a fear of the law, a hazardous waste law, like, my first 2 books are on hazardous waste management. So often a company will react to an existing law. It's only in the last 5 years, Joe, that your generation and the new business leaders are competing for climate competitiveness. So I would have to say it was very difficult. It took a lot of persistence, but we had very smart lawyers and engineers on our team.
And, when I look through the scope of your work, what I find very interesting is, one, it is just impressive how much work you've put out there and the different topics you've covered throughout all of your publications. And I guess my question is, from every book you've written, would you say there is some commonality that kind of ties all of your work together despite covering different topics and themes?
Yeah, I think in humility, you also realize in retrospect, when you watch your friends over time, you can look at yourself. And I'd have to say that from the very beginning, Joe, I had an interest in personal narrative. So even though I was taking pictures and framing landscapes of things changing in society, I wanted to convey it in a personal way. And I think that's why there's so many different things that I had to cut out in different book topics. So take in case what I mean by personal narrative. The first president of Princeton, Jonathan Edwards, gave a great speech when he became president of Princeton University called A Personal Narrative. And he talked about his experiences leading up to him wanting to lead this great school. There's a Quaker called John Woolman, who I read his journal even before America was formed. He was telling a personal narrative of his set of principles and virtues and beliefs. And then, of course, the greatest one that changed my life is Ben Franklin's autobiography, where here's a pragmatic politician talking about how he wants to improve the world. Now, all of those writers, Holman, Franklin, Edwards, and tons of contemporaries, tell the best writing, I think, for me, my type, is personal narrative. If you could embed your sensibility and voice in the context of historic change, then more people will read it than if it's just a dry technical account.
I completely agree, and I think that's what that personal influence is what makes it compelling and interesting for readers, and it makes people want to, it makes people believe in it, I think. And you know, for me, it's really interesting to look at how your work has shifted a little bit over time and what your new, like now I'm really fascinated by your focus on your new focus on social response capitalism. And
oh, sure. And
I would love to hear more about it from your perspective, and then we could talk a little bit more about your new books that cover it.
Sure. Well, I think what I'd like to say, Joe, is that once you develop the style of personal narrative, it becomes an endless search to improve your next book so that you can feel more authentic or more valid, right? So that one of the reasons I've written now 5 biographies is that I like the idea of studying somebody else's life to watch how they achieved authenticity. Like my book, The Quiet Genius of Eileen Fisher, the fashion queen. I'm really studying how she remained authentic and valid. Or my book on giants of social investing. It's about 2 giant investors who don't want to just only make money in their investments. They want to improve society. John Stewart of Calvert Investments and Jack Robinson of Trillium. So in the course of writing my books, I came to see that after the 2007 financial crisis, capitalism itself was beginning to change. I had always advocated that it become less selfish and more socially oriented. But after the financial disaster of 2007, which is when I wrote a book called World Inc. on globalization, I began to see that there were more and more capitalists that shared my view as the owner of a corporation, which was that we have to do not only use human talent in our staff and not only have the ability to serve a customer, we also have to answer social needs. And I was very lucky, Joe, and I got an assignment from Toyota when they wanted to change the nature of the car to go towards the hybrid powertrain. And so we were a part of the initial team that came up with the Prius, whereby you use less gasoline and have less climate impact by using the static in the braking, right? And so I began to see that there were these companies out there who were willing to change on behalf of social need. There are some companies that are totally focused on this, like Unilever, where they have 300 different brands, like Ben & Jerry's ice cream or Dove soap, but they all share some vital public interest or public health motivation behind them. Right. So to me, social response capitalism is the exact opposite of speculative capitalism. Speculative capitalism is someone wanting to make a vast amount of money by just popping a hole in the earth and hoping that oil will gush through. And it distorts through a focus on quick results. Social response capitalism is when someone uses human talent and distribution and the tools of capitalism to answer social needs. Toyota answering the need of more efficient mobility. Unilever answering the need to keep many people in 190 countries clean through the soaps that they make affordable. And in a sense, they actually have made Dove soap lovable, right? So all the techniques of changing human behavior to want a product that's socially good is my newest fascination. And I call that social response capitalism. I first wrote about it in World Inc. in 2007, and that book bounced around into 10 different foreign editions. So I found out that in a non-American setting, there are more people willing to think about this responsible capitalism than sometimes in America, where we have this huge set of extremes where either you're a capitalist or you're a socialist. My work is about finding the capitalist engine to move in the direction of social need.
What do you think the biggest challenges are to get that message, to like break that message through to people? Because it makes sense, but like you mentioned, there's so many just social constructs here and ideologies that make it hard.
In fact, at some point you realize you don't want to repeat yourself, but my new book looks at the 5 dominant prejudices regarding wealth, the Commonwealth. And I think the biggest resistance is when you think about the people who lead social movements, say Black Lives Matters or the diversity and inclusion movement. They are sometimes perceived as anti-capitalists and sometimes socialists. What I've begun to see about this new world that you live in, the world of hyperconnectivity, the world of 24/7 news cycles, there are more people in the world that are seeking social response capitalism. They want to put their money in the right place. But there was huge amount of resistance, just like in the beginning of the issue of climate change. There was a huge amount of resistance to adding a social purpose to capitalism. So, for example, you may have read that 50 years ago, a man from the Chicago School of Economics believed that the only purpose of capitalism was to make money, right? And now we believe that the purpose of capitalism is to make money, enhance the lives of their employees, and satisfy the needs of stakeholders being investors as well as environmentalists, right? So capitalism itself has emerged in my lifetime to be more complicated and more dynamic.
It's interesting, and I think you're right in that people, and something I've noticed is people do want to spend their money in places that make them feel good, and I think that message goes a long way. And when you were writing your new book, A New Way to Wealth, what made you so fascinated by Benjamin Franklin? Because I know his work is what really drove you to start thinking this way. So I want to
make it personal again, Joe.
Yeah.
So here I am, a basketball player in West Islip High, playing my 4th year of varsity as a senior. And I'm still an angry young man because my father has died. And an ex-principal by the name of Charles Plummer says, Bruce, I don't think you're just an angry young man out there on the basketball court. I think you got a brain. So here's a book that I'd like you to read. And this man, Charles Plummer, literally gave me Ben Franklin's autobiography. Now, luckily, I had hurt my knee and I had reason to be different than the macho MVP that I was being groomed to be, right? And I sat and I read the book and I said, wow, this guy's pragmatic. He's thinking about making sidewalks in a time of mud in Philadelphia. He's thinking of making a public library so he doesn't have to buy all the books himself. He's thinking of eating healthy because he knows that meat costs more money than the way, and so at age 18, I think 17, 18, suddenly I found this book that seemed so practical to me, right? And so after writing a bestseller, Doing More with Less, where I tried to demonstrate in, I think that was 10 years ago, some of the principles of competitive frugality, I decided last year to make a global version and really honor Ben Franklin. That's why he's on the cover. So although I believe in competition and capitalism, I also believe in the power of frugality, where if you waste less in bad moves in business, you won't be sued. If you waste less in choosing the wrong people, right? The book begins with avoiding knuckleheads, right?
Yeah.
And so the whole notion of Ben Franklin is you can be civic and still successful as opposed to just being brutally successful.
So are you, after, dedicating so much time and work to sharing this message of competitive frugality, are you optimistic that, we live in a world where this concept can truly become practiced and embraced?
Yes, I do believe that the world is moving more towards an open type of democracy and an open type of capitalism. Even though, and you see, even in the last January 6th hearing, you see the corrective force of making sure that people live to the letter of the law rather than think of themselves as exceptional, right? I do think that there are plenty of movements. I wrote a piece for the Times Union called Punishing Putin, because I do pay attention to what's bad and evil as well as the good. And so I think that the battle between good and bad, the battle between speculative capitalism and social response capitalism, are almost eternal battles in human history, but they're becoming, in my mind, better. More people are bonding with the good and the better than against it. So I believe that just like Machiavelli's The Prince was very famous for continental competition for a long time, about where the ends justifies the means. Today, we're coming back around to a type of Ben Franklin pragmatism, where it's a give and take between citizens that improves the world. And so as I travel the world, Joe, I'm very fascinated. One time I'm traveling to Istanbul, where they want to translate my stuff into Turkish. And I asked I'm driving with the man who translated my work into Greek. And I asked the driver, who looks very different than me, he's clearly from a Muslim world, I mentioned the name Ben Franklin. And ironically, Joe, he goes, Ben Franklin, he's our man. If he can't do it, nobody can.
That's great.
And so I began to realize that Ben Franklin had become a world citizen.
Yeah.
That lots of people understand his story.
So, with the scope of work you have, if you're communicating with readers and you want them to really gain a full understanding of your work and your values and what you teach, what would you say are the top 2 to 3 books of yours that readers should read to learn?
Well, I'll even say something better than that. Mia Funk of Paris has honored me with a career retrospect that's 50 minutes long.
Okay.
And if you go to One Planet Podcast or Mia Funk's creative process and put in my name, Bruce Piasecki, you'll come up with her rendition of the best parts of the books, with some commentary from some other people besides her. So a person could start by just listening to that overview. But I would think that my book, Doing More with Less, or A New Way to Wealth, are the places to start, because they're 150-page short books. World Inc. was trying to change the ministers of finance around the world, and it's a 300-page monster. I don't recommend it, right? But A New Way to Wealth is, I think, less than 150 pages.
Okay. And I'm curious, you're clearly someone who's always writing. Are you working on any projects in the future that people can keep an eye out for?
Oh, I'd love to tell you about this one. So I've been on select boards lately. If you live long enough, Joe, you get invited to corporate boards and they give you stock and stuff like that. Well, I've been volunteering for 6 years to a board called the Medical Consortium on Public Health and Climate Change. It's a set of 9 doctors and 2 business guys. And during those years, I've watched this man called Bill Novelli. He's the former CEO of ARP, the association of 2,000 people, fighting on behalf of retired persons. And he also invented a type of public affairs when he ran a firm called Porter Novelli, which he sold at age 42. So I'm writing a book about this man Novelli, and I'm going to call it The Good Boss, because I came to realize when I went to a celebration of him turning 80 at Georgetown, that the woman who introduced him said, this man Novelli is the best boss that a woman could hope to have. And then suddenly, spontaneously, There were a dozen other women that got up from this group of 80 and said, and we testify that. I don't think it was planned. And so I became fascinated. What makes this guy a good boss? Even my wife, who doesn't like meeting many corporate types, says the first time she met him, what a wonderful man he is. So my new project is trying to use his life to define, so that maybe 300 years from now, someone comes across this little book called The Good Boss, and they kind of understand what were the characteristics of a good boss during that man's 50 years of practice.
What have you picked up so far, if you want to share anything that have been influential for him?
One definitely interesting thing is humor. Like Abe Lincoln or Charlie Chaplin, he is hilariously attentive. The humorous too. The other thing is, when I ask the women, some of them are now running things like Meals for Wheels, or running tobacco-free kids. You know, they're running men and women that he bounced against during his life. They came to this Georgetown thing. And when I asked them, why would you say he's a good boss? They would often say, he paid attention to me.
Yeah.
Which was really, he didn't pay attention to the numbers only, he had paid attention to them. So those are the two things that I take away: sense of humor, and also paying attention to the person that's serving the organization.
It's interesting you say, and like when someone reads that in 300 years, because it brings me to one of the final things I want to touch on. It's that, you know, you've written work from the 1980s until now, and your work stands out because to me, it seems like everything you've written about in different decades is as relevant today as it was then. You know,
wow, you're making me feel good about all that sitting on my butt, Joe.
It's you know, like you've seemed to be always been like just a bit ahead of your time. So I don't know if there was any way that, you know, a way of thinking that leads to creating timeless work, but you know, from your whole scope of work, it seems like it's always going to be relevant. I think that's
very nice of what you're saying. I think that has again to do with personal narrative, Joe.
Yeah.
But the other thing to say, in all honesty, when you start a new book, you oscillate between fear and joy. If you stay honest to those emotions, the fear, oh no, no one's going to care about this subject. That's the fear. No one, even if your agent is representing it, no one really is going to read this book. That's the fear part. But then the joy of completing the composition. And so I would say, I thought I might write 10 books in my life. And now when I finish number 20, I want to write another 10. Yeah. They're like airplanes flying in your head. And part of the pleasure is landing them. But there is fear as well as joy.
And I think that's really good advice for other authors too. Like, you don't want to let that fear consume you. Just keep writing. Put it out.
Well said. And that's another Ben Franklin lesson.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. He just kept plugging along, man, Joe.
Well, I really appreciate your time. Those are my only questions. I will share links where everyone could purchase your work and learn more about you in the interview. So thank you, Bruce, so much for being here. I really appreciate the time.
I am honored, Joe. You be well.
Thank you. Take care.
Be well. Bye-bye.